This is FDR and the New Deal, Objective 3, about the controversies surrounding the New Deal programs. And remember from Objective 2 that Americans were starting to demand government help more and more during the Great Depression. And if they couldn't get government help, they at least wanted help from the owners of the businesses they were working in. There were a lot of labor strikes in the 1930s as workers were demanding some kind of basic health insurance, some kind of basic unemployment insurance, some kind of basic welfare. Well, capitalist economics, which had been very popular in the Roaring '20s for obvious reasons, doesn't provide that. Capitalist economics is more about having your hands off the economy and you taking care of yourself. So capitalism doesn't provide those things. And for that reason, in the Great Depression, capitalism was becoming less and less popular. But what was increasing in popularity was socialism, the idea of raising taxes and taking care of the people with unemployment benefits and welfare and basic health insurance. That's socialist economics. And the only place in America to really find that as a philosophy was in the American Communist Party, which had its greatest boom in membership in its history during the Great Depression. Remember that communism is a combination of dictatorship and socialist economics, and a lot of people like the idea of being taken care of. As a result, not only did the American Communist Party have its highest membership in U.S. history, but 100,000 Americans actually moved to Joe Stalin's Soviet Union to live there because of the socialist economics that they felt would take care of them. Now, Joe Stalin was a dictator. He didn't allow anybody to have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. He could invade their homes anytime he wanted to or punish people in a cruel and unusual way. Basically, everything we have in our Bill of Rights, people were willing to give that up in order to go over there and be taken care of a little bit economically. That's a staggering decision to make, but a lot of people made that in the decade, the only decade we had in American history, where more people were leaving the country than coming to it. Well, in the midst of this, there is another election to be had, the election of 1936, and the New Deal Democrats enthusiastically renominated Franklin Roosevelt. The Republicans, who had claimed that FDR had engaged in a radical, confusing experiment and frightful waste, nominated Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, known as Alf Landon. Also for your timeline is the formation of the American Liberty League in 1934, which was formed to fight New Deal socialism, as they quoted it. Franklin Roosevelt called the American Liberty League and Hoover economic royalists who were hiding behind the Constitution and the flag. And the Democrats therefore started to promote the election as the quote-unquote needy versus the greedy. Labor unions supported FDR. Also, African Americans who had supported the Republicans before, for the first time since the Civil War, turned their loyalties to Franklin Roosevelt, who they felt could help them out. The result was FDR winning in a landslide, 523 to 8 in the Electoral College, as the Republicans only took Vermont and Maine. It was the most lopsided win in 116 years, and the Democrats also took Congress during this particular time. So not only did you have a Democratic president in FDR, but you had Democratic majorities in both houses. From this point on, as far as FDR was concerned, everybody wanted the New Deal, and he had free rein to do what he wanted. Now, the real reason he gets elected is a couple, actually. People decided not to bite the hand that was giving out the relief checks, first of all. I mean, a columnist in a newspaper wrote that nobody shoots at Santa Claus. And he also got more support from Catholics than Democrats really ever had gotten in many elections before. In the 1920s, 1 of every 25 federal judges was Catholic. FDR appointed enough to make it 1 out of every 4. And the 1936 election was significant for another reason, as FDR takes the presidential oath on January 20th, 1937. This was the first time that a president didn't take office in March, a result of, if you remember, the new 20th Amendment that came about after FDR was elected in 1932. However, winning by that big of a margin made FDR cocky, and that led to one of his most controversial schemes, the court packing scheme of his second term. Now, when we say packing the U.S. Supreme Court, it's basically he wanted to put more judges on the court that would favor his policies because he did not like the policies of, as historians refer to them, the 9 old men of the U.S. Supreme Court. FDR felt like the U.S. Supreme Court had been blocking New Deal reforms and that the elections of 1932 and 1936 indicated that America really desperately wanted the New Deal. But in 9 major cases about the New Deal, FDR lost 7 times. Now, the court was very conservative, like we said. The 9 old men were called that because 6 of the 9 U.S. Supreme Court justices were over 70 years old. And FDR had had enough of the conservative policies and wanted people in there that would be more apt to approve his New Deal, more liberal reforms. Essentially, FDR, a bit full of himself, asks Congress to let him add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. Basically, he wanted 6 more of him, 6 more justices that would support all of his New Deal measures. He wanted them to replace the 6 that were over 70 years old who just simply would not retire. Remember, U.S. Supreme Court justices are allowed to be there for life, and that wasn't good. This court packing scheme, as it was called, would bring the total number of justices to 15, and at least in FDR's eyes, get more justices there who would support his New Deal reforms. This turned out to be a huge political mistake by FDR. He was being seen as dishonestly attempting to gain the power of 2 branches of the government, the presidency and the court system, and attempting to become a dictator in some regards. People started to get scared of him. Even those who had supported him were starting to step back and say maybe he was doing a little bit too much and going a little too far with his powers. However, the court did start to change on its own. A conservative named Owen Roberts started voting a little more liberally and actually supporting some of the New Deal policies, and another retired and was replaced by this guy, Hugo Black, who was an outright New Dealer. He was all in favor of what Roosevelt wanted to do. Also, as some of these justices passed away, FDR made 9 appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court, with Hugo Black being his first most significant one. So as it got near the end of his presidency, he was actually getting the New Dealers on the U.S. Supreme Court that he wanted to, but his image in the public had already been damaged with his attempts to pack the court in the first place. Pretty soon, it was obvious that the New Deal was starting to reach its twilight. FDR had made a critical mistake. People in Congress were starting to see him as being too radical, and very few New Deal programs were passed in Congress after 1937, despite the Democratic majorities in Congress. By 1937, unemployment was down from 25% in 1933, but it was still very high at 15%. Also, prosperity from the New Deal had been very modest at best. Plus, there was another recession in 1937 caused by all the Social Security taxes that took spending money away and that government had saved instead of spent themselves. So as a result, FDR announces a greater shift to Keynesian economics, more government spending to stimulate the economy, even if it means putting you in debt so that you have to borrow from other people to keep up with the spending. It's called deficit spending, and it's based on British economist John Maynard Keynes. This model of deficit spending would become the government model for decades to come. Congress, meanwhile, like I said, in reaction to FDR's court-packing attempts and other things, was becoming more conservative about New Deal measures, even though they were Democratic majorities. However, they did pass the Hatch Act in 1939, that's also for your timeline, to prevent federal administrative officers from active political campaigning and soliciting funds or using government funds for political purposes. It didn't really work because people found a way around it, but that's how it goes. And by 1939, the New Deal had lost momentum. Republicans had taken many of the seats in Congress back in the 1938 midterm elections, and the beginning of World War II in Europe in 1939 was starting to take the attention of the American people away from the New Deal and more toward the war. So, in the end, how is the New Deal to be viewed? Well, there's 2 distinct sides. The right-wing conservatives said that it was far too much. It was too much taxing, it was too much spending, it was too much government involvement, it was too much regulation, because, frankly, that's what Republicans say. The Democrats basically said, the left-wing Democrats basically said that it wasn't far enough. There should have been more taxing, there should have been more spending, there should have been more government involvement in what was going on. Because, frankly, that's what the Democrats have always basically said too. Its foes said that its alphabet soup programs like the CWA, the HOLC, the NIRA, the NRA, the FERA, the SS, all these things, they referred to this mockingly as alphabet soup and said that it was wasteful, incompetent, and confusing. They claimed that FDR had only the same effect that an earthquake would have had, just shaking things up but really not changing anything. The national debt during this time, because remember, it's deficit spending, so the national debt during this time had climbed from $19 billion to $40 billion in the 7 years from 1932 to 1939. Critics claimed that the U.S. now stood for unlimited spending, and that a once self-reliant America had now had a case of the gimmies, quote unquote, as they call it, just give me this and give me that and give me that. They said that wishbones had become larger than backbones, as people didn't really want to pick themselves up anymore, they just wanted to collect. They basically said that Americans, one of the quotes was, Americans had gone west at one time in our history to make something of themselves. Now they just went on relief. Business leaders were once again saying that FDR was a traitor to his class and that labor was being pampered. They said the successful could have gotten out of the Great Depression themselves if FDR hadn't taken away all their money in taxes. They basically said that private enterprise was being dwarfed by planned socialism that the government was bringing about. And also criticized were the tax and spend policies, as well as the court packing scheme and trying to get rid of 3 senators who didn't support the New Deal. These were all measures that Roosevelt took to get his New Deal programs passed through, but it scared people quite a bit to see Franklin Roosevelt gaining that much power and exercising that much power. A lot of people started referring to him as Rooseveltsky, an obvious reference to him being a Russian, and said that Rooseveltsky was creating a communist state. And finally, there was the obvious. The New Deal really did not end the Great Depression. In the end, production for World War II ended the Great Depression. You got into the war, stuff blows up, you got to make more, people get put back to work, and there's a constant demand for new stuff as things get blown up. You have to constantly supply that. Now, war isn't the best answer to solve an economy, especially when it drags on too long. It can become a drain on the resources. But most economists would tell you that it was the war that ended the Great Depression, not necessarily the New Deal programs. But there's also support for the New Deal when you look at it in a different light as well. Supporters said that somebody was at least trying to do something about the Great Depression, and that many people had been put back to work. Roosevelt said that when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on, and his attitude and his fireside chats over the course of the Great Depression gave people hope at a time when they really didn't have it. Now, don't get me wrong, the U.S. government was, at this time, by far the biggest employer in the United States, and Roosevelt always claimed that the goal of the New Deal programs was not to end the Depression, but just to gain relief from it. The claim has often been made by economists that the total collapse of the American capitalist economy had been avoided because of FDR and the New Deal programs, and that business should actually thank FDR for preventing the nation from becoming totally socialist, exactly what people were accusing him of trying to turn it into. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but one thing that can't be argued is that FDR in his presidency had managed to have the country avoid bloody revolution to either kind of dictatorship, fascism or communism, at a time when nations around the world were turning that way. The Soviet Union under Joe Stalin was communist. Adolf Hitler was rising as a fascist leader in Europe. And the United States didn't do that. We maintained a democracy that was precious to everybody. Now, whether or not you support the New Deal or not, there's strong arguments for both sides. The foes of the New Deal, what they have to say can't be ignored because there's a lot of truth to that. And the supporters of the New Deal have a point as well. The foes of the New Deal are going to speak more economically, and they make a lot of sense. The supporters of the New Deal are going to speak more emotionally and the hope that FDR gave, and they're going to make a lot of sense as well. In the end, it's really up for history and you to decide whether or not the New Deal has a positive legacy or a negative legacy. And again, that's really up to history to decide for us. That's it. Thanks for listening.